Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for making it to the end. I also want to thank all of the organizers and the staff who've been so wonderful in making this event happen. And I also want to thank Peter Cindy for the Narratives of Debt Conference, where I first started working on this piece. And I would like to dedicate this talk to the Chilean protesters who are working every day to undo a really repressive state apparatus that's always, of course, related to economic apparatuses, and that's what I'm going to speak about today. And that protesting group includes the protesters against sexual violence that Dr. Lewis mentioned yesterday at the beginning of our day. So I want to start where I left off last spring. Do we have, there's something? Yeah. Okay. Which is with a poem by Cecilia Vicuña. For those who are unfamiliar, Cecilia Vicuña is a poet, a visual artist, and a performance artist who's been in exile from Chile for most of her life. She left Chile to study art in 1972, and then she was in Europe and kind of missed the coup, but her family had connections to Allende, so she actually never returned to Chile. But her artistic work, radically feminist work, shifted after the dream of democratic socialism died with the dictatorship and the rise of Pinochet. Vicuña's continuity of critique is deadly serious, but also playful in its understanding of the interconnectedness of violence in the Americas. I begin today with an untitled sort of performance poem of hers, I guess, read in May of 2002 at the Poetry Project in New York City. And this poem is untitled, as her performance poems often were. In fact, they're usually actually transcribed after the fact from listening to her read, as this one was. And it's really through Vicuña's work today that I really want to trace the contours of my argument about debt, which asks that if we consider debt refusal and debt strike as a completely legitimate, just, rational, you can't ever get out of the language of the Enlightenment, unfortunately, response to the escalating accrual of monetary or economic debt in the Americas. And it's primarily through looking at the US's imperial relationship through the University of Chicago and other modes of Chile and the island of Puerto Rico that I want to make my claims today. So I want to start with a poem, and I'm going to try to do this well, but I want you to actually see what the poem looks like transcribed on the page. So I'm going to click, and I can't see. There we go. I'll start, and I'll try to pick this up as best as I can. So this is how she starts. And this is just an excerpt of a much longer piece. A message came. It says, Guaycapuru Cuauhtémoc has been speaking to the European community on February the 8th, 002. He said, Usura, brothers, you who ask us to pay you our debt, you who are asking to pay you our debt, in reality, I loaned you millions and millions and millions and millions of gold and silver as a friendly gesture of the Americas towards the development of Europe. This was our Marshal Tesuma plan for the reconstruction of the barbaric Europe. Poor them, but it failed. Look, it is the irrational capitalistic ways. They are still at it. Europe always wants more. They need more from us. But the time has come for I can't even say it, your up, to return to us the gold and silver we so generously loaned. We ask you to now sign a letter of intent as a way to discipline you. And then later in the poem, she says, and this is not her reinscribing this earlier piece, I wanted to tell you, after your September 11th, which is also my second September 11th, I decided to go to BA, that's Buenos Aires, to take a little refuge. Look at the refuge I picked, huh? I was there, and even a few weeks before the whole thing started, I was scribbling down these notes. These notes that were perhaps in everyone's minds about the deuda. You know what the deuda is? The deuda is the debt, the so-called debt. If you go now to the drawing center, you'll find a little scrap of paper that Ellsworth Kelly took to make a drawing in it. And you will see a little ad from the New York Times, and it says, Argentina is going to pay the debt, 1959. La deudita, la deudita. If you open the word deuda in Spanish, it becomes deuda. De from u, da, give. You can read it in Portuñol. That's the future language of South America. And it becomes God gives, deuda. Turn around the U in a U-turn, turned inside out, the U. Vicuña's poem combines ingenious wordplay to reframe the U of the IOU of the external debt payments by Latin America to Europe and the US in relationship to colonial extraction. She does this through citing a fake performance by Cacique Guaycapuro Cuauhtemoc, which is an alias of the Venezuelan author Luis Brito Garcia, who wrote a satirical letter asking for recompense for the silver and gold extracted during the conquest and the colonization of the Americas with interest. This letter linked extraction from the colonies to the Marshall Plan, which goes exactly back to Ariella and I's conversation yesterday, showing the very differences between the types of aid given to Europe and those given or not given to Latin America in relation to reconstruction and repair after the harm done by war to those nations. By referencing Moctezuma, and by default, pun fully intended, his relationship to Cortés in Spain, Brito Garcia ironizes the idea of debt and predatory lending over the last 500 years. At the end of the letter, he simply asks for Europe to pay the Americas back, using the language of financial capitalism, and the letter itself is worth quoting, and this isn't a translation. To argue that Europe in half a millennium has been unable to generate sufficient wealth to cancel that modest interest would be tantamount to admitting its absolute financial failure and/or the insane irrationality of its capitalist assumptions. Such metaphysical questions, of course, do not worry us Indo-Americans, but we do demand the signing of a letter of intent to discipline the debtor peoples of the old world and to require them to fulfill their commitment by way of a prompt privatization or restoration of Europe, allowing them to give it to us whole as the first payment of this historic debt. Brito Garcia's co-option of the language of the IMF, an entity that was notably created in the same period as the Marshall Plan, does the rhetorical work that structural readjustment policies do, admonishing the borrower for their insolvent debt that they, in fact, have resources they've, in fact, extracted. The neo-colonial infantilization that is a part of these processes, of course, is also a structure based in racial capitalism of the type Walter Mignolo, Aníbal Quijano, and many others have written about so persuasively as part and parcel of the colonial project beginning in the 16th century. Vicuña's collage of contemporary text in this performance poem not only enacts a decolonial critique of Latin American sovereign debt through the incorporation of Brito Garcia's letter, but also redefines debt as a concept, pulling apart deuda, debt's Spanish counterpart, by giving attention to the phonetics and connotative meanings of the UU, is how she succeeds. As a prelude, she explores the word usura, or usury, underscoring the illegal practice of lending at very high rates of interest, investing her audiences into a homophonic UU in advance of encountering deuda. Her extension of deuda into deuda makes the ungrammatical but connotatively clear you from give, you give to us, which changes the direction of who gives and who takes. Perhaps it's time for a more standard definition. So in the contemporary dictionary of Spanish language, monetary debt, sin, and obligation are listed as the first three definitions of debt. But what's interesting is if you look at those sort of subsidiary definitions that give examples that are often under formal definitions, when you look at the Spanish language dictionary, you'll notice that almost all of the definitions deal with with state debt, actually. So consolidated debt, exterior debt or external debt, floating debt, which deals with the floating currency. So there's a way in which it seems no accident that debt owned by the state are all these sort of examples after debt is defined. And suffice it to say, English language dictionaries do not have this focus. It's also curious that one important definition is missing here, and I would say that definition is odious debt, also known as illegitimate debt, which occurs, quote, when a country's government misappropriates money it has borrowed from another country. In the past, this definition has been used way too sparingly, and largely only when a bad apple dictator loots the coffers of the government. But clearly, it can be applied more broadly to any kind of debt that does not benefit the populace of the country whose leaders borrowed it. The originating event, which is kind of interesting in terms of the way odious debt was conceptualized, was in relation to Cuba's debts after the 1898 Spanish-American War, and I think that genealogy is really important. Ultimately, when Vicuña translates into Portuñol, she comes up with God gives, which brings us to the issue of the term in its late medieval and early modern usage in Europe, where it was often used as sort of in a spiritual and economic sense simultaneously, if you think about the Lord's Prayer, for example. And in Matthew's version, which uses the word debt rather than trespass, actually, muddying the distinction between forms of obligation or repair. I'll refrain from exegesis here into medieval and early modern European religious history and translations of the Greek, but I do wish to gesture to how this problematic is crucial to the idea of morality put forth by Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morals, who thinks about morality in some sense in a logic of exchange. And going to Nietzsche is primarily important for me in terms, because of the way that the two, I think, most read theorists of debt, probably, David Graeber and Maurizio Lazzarato, theorized through Nietzsche. Graeber dismisses Nietzsche as bourgeois in his theorizing, suggesting that debt and the ability to honor debts, should not in fact be used as a key component of morality, as debts are in fact, in some sense, meant to be unpayable social bonds. His project reveals that the issue with creditors and debtors in the system today is not the idea of debt, but the impersonal abstraction of debt into mathematical equivalence or maybe abstraction. Lazzarato, meanwhile, traces Nietzschean Foucauldian theorizations of Homo economicus, theorizing the emergence of the indebted man as a new form of discipline that exceeds the possibilities offered by Foucault's The Birth of Biopolitics. So the indebted man overtakes the idea of the entrepreneurial man, and that's sort of, I would think, the genealogy that he's tracing. And so what Lazzarato says is that today the indebted man is not an entrepreneur of the self, right, which is the Foucauldian sort of thought, but someone who, quote, takes on to oneself the costs and risks of economic and financial disaster. I always find it interesting that Foucault wrote that in the 70s and didn't look at Chile at all as the exact example of what he could have proved. It's always kind of shocking to me. Miranda Joseph, as a theorist and historian of accounting, has roundly and successfully critiqued Graeber, in part by re-engaging Marx, revealing the asymmetrical modes of accountability in relationship to the prison industrial complex and the university. She does this in part by engaging the word of Saidiya Hartman on slavery and debt. We are reminded, of course, here of how unpaid labor, slavery of Africans, slavery of indigenous people, the encomienda, indentured servitude, and tribute were crucial to colonial and capitalistic projects in the Americas. And it's also here that we might engage with the very different conception of debt put forth in Moten and Harney's Undercommons. Looking at the university through the lens of the Black radical tradition, Moten argues for the possibility of fugitivity as a mode of occupying the university, which entails a reconceptualization and reevaluation of unpayable debt between learners. As they put it, and he's also, of course, gesturing to the legacy of slavery, but as he and Harney put it, quote, the Black radical tradition is unconsolidated debt. I see my operation as parallel to Harney and Moten's in terms of thinking globally, but I think I'm just thinking in a slightly different geopolitical site and with a different history. But I think they and I today are both dedicated to pushing back a bit against the implicit theorization of debt violence through the recent experiences of Europe and the US, namely the 2008 financial crash, austerity measures in Europe, the Occupy movement, and the student debt crisis in the US and Europe. And I'm really reminded here of Keisha Khan's talk yesterday in terms of sort of occupying, having a 30-year history for Afro-Brazilians, even though it comes into a different register of theorization with the Occupy movement. So there's a much longer history of occupation here that I would gesture to. But for now, what I want to do is turn to the work of Sophia McLennan, who concentrates on the relationship of debt to human rights, tracing the transformations of the relationships between the two through debt events in Latin America. In doing so, she shows how, quote unquote, individual debt is linked to state debt in modes that exceed Lazarato and Graeber's imaginings, even though she leans into the latter's theorization. As she claims, quote, at a basic level, the consumer debt crisis, student loans, and bankruptcy are very much, quote unquote, first world problems. In fact, at a certain level, we have an entire population of citizens that's never had access to an individual entrepreneurial credit-driven society because they've been collectively supporting an indebted state, unquote. Her engagement asks us to think of what she calls, quote, the making of the indebted state, as well as the making of the indebted man. As she continues, quote, the ideas of debt in civil society are radically altered if we take a post-colonial view. The assumptions of equality and reciprocity that underpin the debtor-creditor relationship are wholly broken in a system where nation states are not able to exercise the sovereignty required to be a creditor, and where, rather than being paid reparations for the violence of the colonial system, they are rewarded with the honor of owing their former colonizers' debt, unquote. And it's as a result of the spread of what Naomi Klein would call the shock doctrine principles and the Pinochet regime, of course, incubated wonderfully in the University of Chicago in the 50s and 60s and exported through the US university system into the Chilean university system, that this regime modeled and exported to the so-called developing, but we might say maybe formerly colonized world, the very kind of predatory variable credit schemes at the level of sovereign debt that are so new to the middle class in the US as personalized mortgage debt. And my use of the middle class there is a little too broad, but I guess what I mean to say is that, that there's always this deep connection between personal debt and sovereign debt. And these kinds of interest rates that might be incredibly new to some people aren't new to others. You know, anybody who's actually had a family like my own that suffered through a payday loan knows exactly what kind of extraction occurs in terms of variable interest rates on short calendars. In this form of variable interest rate exploitation, if this form of variable interest rate exploitation was moved from Latin America to the US traded this violence for another right to debt. The introduction in Latin America of a credit card industry that needed ever more consumers, which they found in the formerly colonized world. This new market incursion escalated personal debt in many places, including Chile, where today people use credit cards to meet their most basic needs, including medical care, which is part of why the protests are happening. Clara Hahn's harrowing but brilliant ethnography, Life and Debt, Times of Care and Violence in Neoliberal Chile, brings it home by explaining the quotidian reality of poor and working class Santiago residents who must borrow from each other in order to survive. And although Hahn witnesses many kindnesses between neighbors, she also sees how people replicate the state's language of responsibility and violence as a justification sometimes to not help a neighbor. Moreover, her book suggests that Lazarato's indebted man is just as likely to be a woman without a university education as an indebted male university student. What's so frustrating about the outcry about debt conditions in the contemporary US is that close analysis of Chile and admitting our own complicity in Chile as a site to understand the future possibilities of the disaster of finance capitalism is so often lacking in analysis. Even McLennan, who so eloquently makes her case through Latin American examples, claims that, quote, the part of the story that we missed back in the 70s was that it was not just the torture of bodies that would haunt these nations as they tried to heal, it would also be the debt. But not everybody missed it. As Chilean exile Orlando Letelier claimed in The Nation in August 1976, quote, repression for the majorities and economic freedom for small privileged groups are in Chile two sides of the same coin. He was murdered in Washington, D.C. by a Pinochet operative a month after he published this editorial, making clear the consequences of speaking out against economic violence. And it's only recently that Naomi Klein introduced and they republished this essay on the 40th anniversary of his death. It's an amazing essay. But But perhaps more cautiously than Letelier, Vicuña makes her point in 2002 by implicitly linking Chile's reality to Argentina's to make her case. When Vicuña was writing this poem, Argentina was going through its own debt crisis, during which the peso dropped through the floor. Despite deeply wounding austerity measures, Argentina nonetheless defaulted on their foreign debt by the end of December 2001, and many people lost their savings, if they even had savings. The irony of Vicuña's respite from 9/11 in New York by going to Argentina is hilarious and tragic, but also reveals the mundanity of the economic violence of debt through much of the world. And I'm thinking yesterday, Emily, in your talk about how you feel to qualify violence, and how I feel like I have to qualify violence by saying economic violence, and I really question that, actually. That Vicuña can link the larger history of debt to a piece of scrap newspaper in an Ellsworth Kelly drawing provides a genealogy of external debt that exceeds the bounds of the neoliberal era. And if one looks back to her performative mistakes in offering the accurate date for the speech that she quotes, this work becomes clear. On February the 8th, 002, gestures to what's often occluded, the many financial crises of the so-called liberal era in Latin America in the 19th and early 20th centuries, 1822, 1873, 1880, 1890, 1929. These crises include those in Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, amongst others, and these countries fought to become independent. As these countries fought to become independent and adopt liberal governments, they often had to recover not only from their vulnerability to global financial crises, but also from wars and invasions. And to get out of that, they actually had to borrow money from London merchants. This was the price of liberty, to misquote Alexander Hamilton. And now, to everyone's potential elation, or perhaps disappointment, it is to Hamilton the musical we must go. So Hamilton, as surely almost everybody in the room knows, was the breakaway hit of the so-called Obama post-racial era. Based on Ron Chernow's biography of a founding father, Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical is a perfect homage to the post-racial era and to a US entrepreneurial fetish. Many wonderful historians, musicologists, and theater and performance studies scholars have underscored this coalescence. Others have called to task Miranda's lack of inclusion of any African-American or Native characters, engaged with his lack of engagement with slavery or genocide as part of the history of dispossession of the Americas, and righted the wheel by exposing his distortion of the facts of Hamilton's life, which is arguably something he actually inherits from Chernow, so it's not all Lin Miranda's fault. Others have historicized the erasures of his immigrant retelling of Hamilton's upstart life story, as well as the play's gender politics, even as all admit some of the production's innovations in casting POC on Broadway, although if you actually do a history of Broadway, you have to kind of undo that one too. I'm not here to shoot Hamilton again, but to reveal that it is as much a play about debt as it is about entrepreneurialism, immigrant greatness, or revolution. As Michael O'Malley suggests in his essay about Hamilton, the historical Hamilton's history is caught up in the history of finance. But back to the present. Scholars and activists on the island and on the mainland have insisted that Miranda's touring of Hamilton to San Juan, Puerto Rico as a fundraiser should be seen for what it is, a celebration of bootstrapping entrepreneurialism encased in neoliberal philanthropy, which alongside Lin-Manuel and his father's rather unfortunate support for Promesa, the austerity program, of a sort of bringing in an external board to fix Puerto Rico's debt problem, which is actually our problem, that this was a recipe for the justified protest of the production. And there was a lot of protest of the production on the island. Ed Morales' expiation of that production in his recent book on the history of Puerto Rican debt, Fantasy Island, is brilliant. He reminds us that Hamilton, the man, centralized the nascent power of the newly independent US by concentrating fiscal power in the hands of an elite core of powerful investors. He also tells us straight that choosing to produce Hamilton, the musical, on the island on a stage, quote, provided by a population that's come to realize that their island nation is and has been a colony of the US since 1898, and that it's destined to repay a massive amount of debt plus interest to a small coterie of Wall Street bankers and vulture fund moguls, unquote, is nothing short of ridiculous. The close reading theater historian in me wishes to make one further point. Entrepreneurial swagger may begin this musical, but at Hamilton's center, its literal fulcrum at the top of Act Two, is the ultimate tale about US war debt, the dramatization of the Compromise of 1790. Beginning with the cabinet battle, number one, and ending with the famous The Room Where It Happens, we watch as Hamilton tries to convince Congress to assume state war debts as national debt in exchange for putting the capital city of Washington, D.C. The duel, largely between Jefferson and Hamilton, with all of its witty wordplay, gives way to the eponymous character's hard and not quite solitary work to get the work done. This solitariness, of course, is Hamilton's affair with Maria or Mariah Reynolds. Fascinatingly, and I'm gonna put the lyrics to the song up here, but I'm not gonna read them all. Say No to This tells the story of this liaison. It begins when Hamilton gives a loan, or maybe a gift, of $30 to her. She then seduces him. Of course, once her husband finds out, he extorts money from Hamilton. Interest rates, one might say, that go far beyond the premium. And this is referred to in Hamilton the Revolution, or Hamiltome as it's known, and elsewhere as the first American sex scandal. Hamilton's public address of the affair ultimately led to his political demise. How this affair related to his own poor personal financial health, his BBB- Standard & Poor's rating perhaps, is not beyond the scope of this paper. My point, however, is simply this, that Hamilton, the musical, knows that bad debt, and I don't mean this in Fred Moten's sense, and war debt are at the heart of entrepreneurialism, and that these modes of exchange are also part of interpersonal private relations that may or may not be entirely post-racial. While Hamilton and Reynolds in real life were both white, one must remember that Mariah Reynolds was played by Jasmine Cephas Jones, an African-American woman, opposite a light, if not quite white-passing, Lin-Manuel. Paying attention to what we are seeing as well as what we're hearing might interrogate the so-called post-racial Obama era of black-brown multiracial democracy the musical is credited with reflecting. Simply stated, the secret that Hamilton seems to obscure is actually exposed if you would do a close, if paranoid reading. In Cephas Jones' words, if you pay, you can stay. So I veered to Hamilton largely because of the way that the musical became popular during the very financial transformation Lazzarato seems as marking the end of entrepreneurial homo economicus and the beginning of a new era of the indebted man. And it's here that I want to periodize the musical economically. Following McLennan's lead, I argue that Hamilton shows us that homo economicus and the indebted man have coexisted for longer than we think in the developed and especially in the so-called developing or formerly colonized world. As a theater scholar of Latinx performance, I'm not at all surprised that Broadway has run away to the bank with the most valedictory mode of the unidirectional immigration myth and entrepreneurial self-making ideology possible. But at the same time, I remember that many Latinx plays, which almost but did not quite make it into the mainstream, did not do so because they reject Hamilton's premises. Today, I'll concentrate on only one, Jose Rivera's 1999 Marisol, a play with a Nuyorican protagonist who realizes that her commitment to assimilation, to both whiteness and to capitalism, will not save her. In fact, she ends up being one of the homeless characters throwing rocks at the sky at the play's end. Marisol also, I'm just gonna put this up here, features an exchange, a sort of a rather creepy debtor's prison for consumers who cannot pay their credit card bills. And this exchange that I've actually put up here describes it, where Marisol says, "What's that huge, ugly, windowless building with smokestacks and armed guards across the street?" And June says, "Me, I think it's where they bring, that's where they bring overthrown, brutal right-wing dictators to live, because a friend's a friend, right?" And Lenny says, "Wrong, it's a federally funded torture center where they violate people who've gone over their credit limit. I've seen them in the vans, June, so shut up, people tied up, guards with truncheons, big, fat New York City police with dogs. It happens late at night, but you can hear the screams. They cremate the bodies. That's why Brooklyn smells so funny." And Marisol says, "I owe a lot of money to the MasterCard people." If Rivera wrote this play today, he might have added educational debt and mortgage debt to the list of offenses for those unfortunates housed away somewhere in Brooklyn. But Rivera does understand that these debt histories are deeply interdependent. So I'm going to try to wrap up fairly quickly, but without dismissing Lazarado's theorization of the indebted man, I offer Marisol as a corrective to his timeline and to his geopolitics. And it's here that I would ask us to imagine differently and look to the Chilean protests from 2001 to the present to consider the possibilities of mobilizing against debt and neoliberalism more broadly through what we might call a debt strike, debt cancellation, a debt jubilee, and a debt refusal. And the move, I would argue, to redefine almost all sovereign debt is odious debt. And this was actually advocated for, I just want to say, in 1907 and 1988 by two Brazilian social theorists, Sue Bradford and Kuczynski. So it's already been done, it's not new. But to go back to the students, the global movements of 2001 brought attention to the very materiality of debt for a generation of students who are fighting against the privatization of education so as to reimagine social relations in terms of coalitional imperatives against injustice. But one example was the flash mob thriller that reenacted the famous Michael Jackson video to materialize the experience of the undead in terms of student debt. And I can talk about that more. I was thinking a lot, both of Dixa and Jasmine's talk when I was thinking about this performance. As Marcela Fuentes claims, following Lazarato, Harney, and Moten, the debt created by the privatization of education is a temporal discipline that entails the structuring of vital time as time lived towards fulfilling debt obligations. And she argues that these flash mobs enable students to enact sovereignty over their own time, unbinding them from the creditor-debtor relationship. Another performance which garnered a bit less attention was a relay race called 1800 Hours to symbolize the $1.8 million that Chilean students demanded to fund public education. And that was a relay race where everybody ran a lap around the main plaza, and it went on for 1800 hours, and that protest lasted, or performance lasted 75 days. In Fuentes' terms, this event socialized the burden of running and imagined the end of debt corporeally, countering the ways its participants are asked to shoulder the weight of debt itself in their everyday lives. It's here that performance's protest embodies a new mode of thinking debt, not as a moral obligation, but as a historically material practice that can be resisted. Another option would simply be to burn the promissory notes for said loans. As Chilean activist Papas Fritas did, he stole into a sort of a for-profit university, took all the promissory notes and burnt them, and then absolved people of debt. But today's protests in Chile, which could continue after more than 40 days, also incorporate performance, but are sometimes less joyous than furious. What's striking about them is that their striking has created allegiances by groups that are often not thought of as allied in the US, university students, retirees, poor, working class, and the barely middle class that has been so hamstrung by consumer and mortgage debt. Although class structures are different in the US and Chile, Chile is the developing nation that is perhaps most like the US in its distribution of wealth and its penchant for privatization. Chile was the lab for neoliberalism, and it is a glimpse of its future, a future where debt is normalized as the only way to meet our basic needs. What Chile has that the US does not at this particular moment, I think, is this coalitional politics of these different groups. And as a theater scholar, I find it interesting that this coalition is the very same one that Jose Rivera theorizes in Marisol, that ends with Lenny, June, and Marisol joining the revolution. Rivera's millennial identity anxiety aside, the end point of this play may be our starting point in the war against debt. To join such a revolution, we must reframe debt the way Vicuña does by inverting who is the debtor and who is the creditor here. Deuda, from you give. Thank you.